Hello, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Chad Pillai, U.S. Army Visiting Defense Fellow at the Center for International Defense Policy here at Queen's University. Now, I'm here to provide an overview of the Strategy Bridge. What is the Strategy Bridge? The concept was developed and written about by Colin Gray, an American-British scholar of international relations and strategic studies. He articulated the idea of the Strategy Bridge in his book by the same name, published back in 2010. Colin's premise, in a nutshell, is the idea of connecting policy to operational and tactical actions for strategic effect. Strategy serves as the bridge between those two elements, as seen here by the two quotes on the slide. To fully appreciate the complexity of the Strategy Bridge, Colin Gray develops his famous dicta of strategy, seen here, where he breaks it down into four fundamental parts. First, the nature and character of strategy. Second, making strategy. Third, executing strategy. And fourth and finally, the consequences of strategy. Making and executing strategy to achieve policy is hard. However, there are examples when it was done correctly. The primary example is the 1991 Gulf War, and I'll break it down into its four component pieces. First, the policy. The President of the United States made it clear that the policy was the ejection of Iraq from Kuwait per the United Nations resolution, and if necessary, to use force to do so. Next, strategy. Was developed by the military, and as you can see here, briefed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, where the overarching strategy was to isolate Iraq and defend Saudi Arabia from further aggression. Next was the operational level of war, led by General Schwarzkopf, the theater commander, who developed two primary operational approaches to the war. First was the attrition by air, to degrade and disrupt the Iraqi military. And then second, a maneuver warfare campaign to compel the Iraqis to leave Iraq and if necessary to destroy the Iraqi army to prevent future aggression. And then last was the tactics. And this is where individual units met the Iraqi army on the field of battle. And the most famous one of these was the Battle of 73 Eastings, where an army cavalry troop encountered, identified, and destroyed an Iraqi battalion in less than a half hour. It is important to note that the strategy bridge does not mean the dialogue between the policymaker and the military leader are equal along a linear plane. In fact, the reality is that the dialogue is unequal, as Dr. Cohen wrote in his book, Supreme Command. In the book, he quotes the French Prime Minister from World War I, Georges Clemenceau, who famously said, "War is too important to be left to the generals." And this is to articulate that war, the ultimate objectives, belong in the space of the political leaders, and only to the political leaders. However, it doesn't mean that friction and tension cannot occur. In a fictional quote from Brigadier Jack D. Ripper from the movie Strangelove, he says, "War is too important to be left to politicians. They have neither the time, the training, nor the inclination for strategic thoughts." Dr. Cohen would vehemently disagree and goes through many case studies in his book on where the political leaders overruled and were proven correct versus the military. And he points out that when there's a disagreement, military leaders have two primary options. First, they can either adapt the strategy to meet the policy ends, or two, they simply can resign. However, there are times where this ideal breaks down. The most famous example is when General Douglas MacArthur challenged the President of the United States on their policy objectives for the war in Korea, made that disagreement public, which forced the President of the United States to fire General Douglas MacArthur publicly and replace him with a new commander. So I'll go into an example of how the unequal dialogue worked both in practice and reality. The best case is from World War II. For the United States, the policy political leader was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the most famous Army general and his advisor was General George Marshall. After the attacks of Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war and agreed upon a firm policy of Germany first, despite being attacked by Japan. All the military leaders understood that the approach was to fight the war in Europe. However, there was disagreements of exactly how and where. General George Marshall vehemently opposed the proposal by the British that the United States conduct an operation in North Africa first. Instead, he preferred that the US build up its forces in England, and then from there attack into France and eventually into the heart of Europe. However, the President of the United States had other factors to consider besides the pure military logic that General Marshall presented. First, he had to consider the implications of the US involvement with the coalition allies, specifically the United Kingdom, and with that, also the role of Canada in the war. Secondly, had to take into account the domestic political realities that the president faced as he was about to enter his third and unprecedented re-election for the President of the United States for the third time. And with that, those two factors overrule general military logic presented by General Marshall, and the president decided that the United States will enter the war and attack into North Africa first. And it proved a wise decision as it allowed the US Army to get its feet wet, enter combat, and learn experience before it then proceeded in its campaigns in Italy, and then afterwards, Normandy, France, and into Germany. The key lesson here is that when generals fail to appreciate the complexity of politics and policy, one of the key things to take into account is often misread or read out of context is the lessons of Niccolo Machiavelli, who's often described as the evil genius, which is incorrect. He was somebody, though, who understood the reality of the political mind and the changes of circumstances that a political person had to factor in when making decisions. And it's important that military leaders appreciate that complexity and have the flexibility to adapt their strategies if needed. And this is best exemplified by the quote from Prime Minister Churchill of the UK, where he said the distinction between politics and strategy diminishes as the point of view is raised. At the summit, true politics and strategy are one. And what he's implying is, again, war, being a tool of policy, is ultimately the responsibility of the political leader. And it is the job of the military leader to apply the art and science of war to achieve that policy's vision. And that is how the strategy bridge works both in practice and in theory and in reality. Thank you.